The Mandate of Heaven. The Zhou Dynasty overthrew the Shang Dynasty, and used the Mandate of Heaven as justification. The fall of the Shang. In 1046 BCE, the Zhou, a subject people living in the western part of the kingdom, overthrew the Shang Dynasty at the Battle of Mui. This was a battle between Shang and Zhou clans, over the Shang's expansion. They largely had the support of the Chinese people. Dxin, the final king of the Shang Dynasty, had become cruel, spent state money on drinking and gambling, and ignored the state. The Zhou established authority by forging alliances with regional nobles, and founded their new dynasty with its capital at Fengyou, near present-day Xi'an, in western China. The Mandate of Heaven. Under the Zhou dynasty, China moved away from worship of Shangdi, celestial lord, in favor of worship of Tian, heaven, and they created the Mandate of Heaven. According to this idea, there could be only one legitimate ruler of China at a time, and this ruler reigned as the Son of Heaven with the approval of the gods. If a king ruled unfairly, he could lose this approval, which would result in his downfall. Overthrow, natural disasters, and famine were taken as a sign that the ruler had lost the Mandate of Heaven. The Mandate of Heaven did not require a ruler to be of noble birth, and had no time limitations. Instead, rulers were expected to be good and just in order to keep the mandate. The Zhou claimed that their rule was justified by the Mandate of Heaven. In other words, the Zhou believed that the Shang kings had become immoral with their excessive drinking, luxuriant living, and cruelty, and so had lost their mandate. The god's blessing was given instead to the new ruler under the Zhou dynasty, which would rule China for the next 800 years. The need for the Zhou to create a history of a unified China is also why some scholars think the Xia dynasty may have been an invention of the Zhou. The Zhou needed to erase the various small states of prehistoric China from history, and replace them with the monocratic Xia dynasty in order for their Mandate of Heaven to seem valid, i.e., to support the claim that there always would be, and always had been, only one ruler of China. The Zhou ruled until 256 BCE, when the state of Qin captured Chengzhou. However, the Mandate of Heaven philosophy carried on throughout ancient China. Society under the Zhou dynasty. Under the initial period of the Zhou dynasty, called the Western Zhou period, a number of innovations were made. Rulers were legitimized under the Mandate of Heaven, a feudal system developed, and new forms of irrigation allowed the population to expand. The first period of Zhou rule, during which the Zhou held undisputed power over China, is known as the Western Zhou period. This period ended when the capital was moved eastward. A number of important innovations took place during this period. The Zhou moved away from worship of Shangdi, the supreme god under the Shang, in favor of Tian, heaven. They legitimized rulers, through the Mandate of Heaven, divine right to rule. They moved to a feudal system, developed Chinese philosophy, and made new advances in irrigation that allowed more intensive farming and made it possible for the lands of China to sustain larger populations. China created a substantial amount of literature during the Zhou dynasty. These include the Book of History and the Book of Diviners, which was used by fortune tellers. Books dedicated to songs and ceremonial rites were also created. While many of these writings have been destroyed over time, their lasting impression on history is evidence of the strength of Zhou culture. Like other river valley civilizations of the time, the people under the Zhou dynasty followed patriarchal roles. Men chose which children would be educated and whom their daughters were married. The household usually consisted of the head male, his wife, his sons and unmarried daughters. The feudal system in China was structurally similar to ones that followed, such as pre-imperial Macedon, Europe, and Japan. At the beginning of the Zhou dynasty's rule, the Duke of Zhou, a regent to the king, held a lot of power, and the king rewarded the loyalty of nobles and generals with large pieces of land. Delegating regional control in this way allowed the Zhou to maintain control over a massive land area. Under this feudal, Fengjian, system, land could be passed down within families, or broken up further and granted to more people. Most importantly, the peasants who farmed the land were controlled by the feudal system. Slavery had been common during the Shang Dynasty, but this decreased and finally disappeared under the Zhou Dynasty, as social status became more fluid and transitory. When the Duke of Zhou stepped down, China was united and at peace, leading to years of prosperity. But this only lasted for about 75 years. Over time, the central power of the Zhou dynasty slowly weakened, and the lords of the fiefs originally bestowed by the Zhou came to equal the kings in wealth and influence. They began to actively compete with them for power, and the fiefs gained independence as individual states. Finally, in 711 BCE, one rebellious noble, the Marquis of Shen, joined forces with invading barbarians, the Quanrong, to defeat the King Yu. No one came to the king's defense, and he was killed. The Zhou capital was sacked by the barbarians, and with this the Western Zhou period ended. Art under the Zhou dynasty. Under the Zhou dynasty, many art forms expanded and became more detailed, including bronze inscriptions, painting, and lacquerware. Bronze, ceramics, and jade. Chinese script cast onto bronzeware, such as bells and cauldrons, carried over from the Shang dynasty into the Zhou. It showed continued changes in style over time, and by region. Under the Zhou, expansion of this form of writing continued, with the inclusion of patrons and ancestors. Other improvements to bronze objects under the Eastern Zhou included greater attention to detail and aesthetics. The casting process itself was improved by a new technique, called the lost wax method of production. Ceramic and jade art continued from the Shang dynasty, and was improved and refined, especially during the Warring States period. Paintings. Very few paintings from the Zhou have survived, however written descriptions of the works have remained. Representations of the real world, in the form of paintings of figures, portraits, and historical scenes, were common during the time. This was a new development. Painting was also done on pottery, tomb walls, and on silk. Lacquerware. Lacquerware was a technique through which objects were decoratively covered by a wood finish and cured to a hard, durable finish. The lacquer itself might also be inlaid or carved. The Zhou continued and developed lacquer work done in the Shang dynasty. During the Eastern Zhou period, a large quantity of lacquerware began to be produced. The Eastern Zhou period. The Eastern Zhou period was divided into two halves. In the Spring and Autumn period, power became decentralized as nobles vied for power. In the Warring States period, strong states fought each other in large-scale war. During the period, there were substantial intellectual and military developments. The end of the Western Zhou period. The first period of Zhou rule, which lasted from 1046 to 771 BCE and was referred to as the Western Zhou period, was characterized mostly by unified, peaceful rule. The lords under feudalism gained increasing power, and ultimately the Zhou king Yu was assassinated, and the capital, Hejing, was sacked in 770 BCE. The capital was quickly moved east to Chengzhou, near modern-day Luoyang, and the Zhou abandoned the western regions. Thus, the assassination marked the end of the Western Zhou period and the beginning of the Eastern Zhou period. The Spring and Autumn period of Eastern Zhou. The first part of the Eastern Zhou period is known as the Spring and Autumn period, named after the Spring and Autumn Annals, a text that narrated events on a year-by-year basis, and marked the beginning of China's deliberately recorded history. This period lasted from about 771 to 476 BCE. During this time, power became increasingly decentralized as regional feudal lords began to absorb smaller powers and vie for hegemony. The monarchy continued to lose power, and the people were nearly always at war. The period from 685 to 591 BCE was called the Five Hegemons, and featured, in order, the hegemony of Qi, Song, Jin, Qin, and Chu. By the end of 5th century BCE, the feudal system was consolidated into 7 prominent and powerful states: Han, Wei, Zhao, Yu, Chu, Qi, and Qin, and China entered the Warring States period, when each state vied for complete control. The Warring States period. This period, in the second half of the Eastern Zhou, lasted from about 475 to 221 BCE, when China was united under the Qin dynasty. The partition of the Jin state created 7 major warring states. After a series of wars among these powerful states, King Zhao of Qin defeated King Nan of Zhou and conquered West Zhou in 256 BCE. His grandson, King Zhuangxiang of Qin, conquered East Zhou, bringing the Zhou dynasty to an end. Developments during the Eastern Zhou. While the chariot remained in use, there was a shift during the period to infantry, possibly because of the invention of the crossbow. This meant that war became larger scale, as peasants were drafted to take the place of nobility as soldiers and needed complex logistical support. The aristocracy's importance dwindled as the kings became stronger, and strong central bureaucracies took hold. The Art of War, attributed to Sun Tzu, was written during this time. It remains a very influential book about strategy. A sophisticated form of commercial arithmetic was in place during the period, as shown by a bundle of bamboo slips showing 2-digit decimal multiplication. A history of the Spring and Autumn period, called the Zhou Commentary on the Spring and Autumn Annals, was published during this time. Developments in ironwork replaced bronze as the dominant metal used in warfare. Trade became increasingly important among states within China. Large-scale works, including the Dujiangjian irrigation system and the Zhenqiu Canal, were completed and increased agricultural production. The Warring States period. The Warring States period saw technological and philosophical development, and the emergence of the Qin dynasty. Over the course of the Spring and Autumn period, regional feudal lords consolidated and absorbed smaller powers. By 476 BCE, 7 prominent states were left, all led by individual kings. The second part of the Eastern Zhou period is known as the Warring States period. During this time these few remaining states battled each other for total power. Conflict among the 7 states. The king by now was powerless, and the rulers of the 7 independent states began to refer to themselves as kings as well. These major Chinese states were in constant competition. Since none of the states wanted any one rival to become too powerful, if one state became too strong, the others would join forces against it, so no state achieved dominance. This led to nearly 250 years of inconclusive warfare that became larger and larger in scale. It was also at this point that there first emerged the concept of a Chinese emperor who would rule over all the various kings, though the first Chinese emperors did not rule until China was unified under the later Qin dynasty. The crossbow was invented, and its low cost and easy use, as compared to the expensive chariot, resulted in the increased conscription of peasants as expandable infantry. Technological and philosophical development. The Iron Age had reached China by 600 CE, but it was during this period that the age spread and took root in China. By the time of the Warring States period, China saw a widespread adoption of iron tools and weapons that were significantly stronger than their bronze counterparts. This period also saw the further development of the philosophical movements that originated in the 100 schools of thought of the Spring and Autumn period. Mencius further developed Confucian philosophy, expanding upon its doctrines and asserting the innate goodness of the individual and the importance of destiny. Daoism, legalism, and Moism became more developed. Archaic writing also gave way to a far more recognizable form of Chinese script. Cultural, economic, and social development. 2 fundamental Chinese social characteristics had become apparent by this time: the concept of the patrilineal family as the basic unit in society, with high importance placed on blood relations, and 2, the concept of natural social differentiation into classes, each regarded in terms of their contributions to society. Large-scale projects, like the Dujiangjian irrigation system and the Zhenqiu Canal, were carried out. Sophisticated arithmetic was carried out, including 2-digit decimal multiplication. The Zhou Commentary on the Spring and Autumn Annals was a literary achievement. In other literary works, sayings of philosophers of the period were recorded in the Analects and the Art of War. The rise of the Qin state and resolution of the Warring States period. Though the military rivalries and alliances in the Warring States period were complex and constantly in flux, over time the Qin state, under the leadership of King Zheng, emerged as the most powerful. The Qin were particularly strongly rooted in legalist philosophy, which advocated the importance of the state at the expense of the individual. They were also known for being ruthless and ignoring etiquette and protocol of war in order to win at all costs. In particular, Shang Yang, advisor to Zheng, enacted laws to force subjects of the kingdom to act in ways that helped the state. He forced them to marry early, have many children, and produce certain quotas of food. Ultimately, in 221 BCE, the Qin state conquered the others and established the Qin dynasty. Chinese philosophy. Confucianism, Daoism, Legalism, and Moism all began during the Zhou Dynasty in the 6th century BCE, and had very strong influences on Chinese civilization. Confucianism. Confucius, who lived during the 6th century BCE, was one of the foremost Chinese philosophers. He looked back on the Western Zhou period, with its strong centralized state, as an ideal. He was pragmatic and sought to reform the existing government, encouraging a system of mutual duty between superiors and inferiors. Confucius stressed tradition and believed that an individual should strive to be virtuous and respectful, and to fit into his or her place in society. After his death in 479 BCE, his students wrote down his ethical and moral teachings in the Lunyu, or Analects. Being a good and virtuous human in every ordinary situation was the goal of Confucianism. This virtue was called Zhen, and humans were seen as perfectible and basically good creatures. Ceremonies and rituals based on the 5 classics, especially the I Ching, were strongly instituted. Some ethical concepts included Yi, the moral disposition to do good, Li, ritual norms for everyday life, and Ji, the ability to see what is right in the behavior of others. Confucianism remained prevalent in China from the Han Dynasty in 202 BCE to the end of dynastic rule in 1911. It was reformulated during the Tang Dynasty, 618 to 907, as Neo-Confucianism, and became the basis of imperial exams. Daoism. Another important philosopher in this period was Lauzu, also called Lauzu, who founded Daoism, also called Taoism, during the same period as Confucianism. Lauzu is a legendary figure. It is uncertain if he actually existed. According to myth, Lauzu was born around 604 BCE as an old man. As he left his home to live a life of solitude, he was asked by the city gatekeeper to write down his thoughts. He did so in a book called Tao Te Ching, and was never seen again. Daoism advocated that the individual should follow a mysterious force, called the Way, Dao, of the universe and act in accordance with nature. Daoism stressed the oneness of all things, and was strictly individualistic, as opposed to Confucianism, which advocated acting as society expected. Daoism as a religion arose over time, and involved the worship of gods and ancestors, the cultivation of qi energy, a system of morals, and the use of alchemy to achieve immortality. It is still practiced today. Legalism. Although Confucianism and Daoism are the Chinese philosophies that have endured most to this day, even more important to this early period was a lesser-known philosophy called legalism. This held that humans are inherently bad and need to be kept in line by a strong state. According to legalism, the state was far more important than the individual. While legalism held that laws should be clear and public and that everyone should be subject to them, it also contended that rulers had supreme power and must use stealth and secrecy to remain in power. Legalists also believed that society must strive to dominate other societies. Legalists could be divided into 3 types. The first was concerned with shi, or the investment of the position of ruler with power, rather than the person, and the necessity of obtaining facts to rule well. The second was concerned with fa, or laws, regulations, and standards. This meant all were equal under the ruler, and the state was run by law, not a ruler. The third was the concept of shu, or tactics to keep the state safe. Legalism was generally in competition with Confucianism, which advocated a just and reciprocal relationship between the state and its subjects. Moism. Moism emerged around the same time as the other philosophies discussed here, under the philosopher Mozi, c. 470 to 391 BCE. The most well-known concept under Moism was impartial care, also known as universal love. This meant that people should care equally about other people, regardless of their true relationship to that person. This opposed the ideas of Confucianism, which said that love should be greater for close relationships. Moism also stressed the ideas of self-restraint, reflection and authenticity. Moism also stated that all people should be equal in their material benefit and in their protection from harm. Society could be improved by having it function like an organism, with a uniform moral compass. Those who were qualified should receive jobs, and thus the ruler would be surrounded by people of talent and skill. An unrighteous ruler would result in 7 disasters for the state, including neglect of military defense, repression, illusions about strength, distrust, famine, and more. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to check out other tracks as well. Show your love by hitting the subscribe button and do like, comment and share, to spread knowledge. See you next time. Till then, keep learning for fun.